Berlin, 1923. You get paid. You do not feel richer. You feel late. You are a factory worker and it is around 11 in the morning. A few minutes ago, your wages still meant something. A few hours from now, they may not. So the second the money touches your hands, your wife takes it and runs for bread before the price changes again. This was life in Weimar Germany, where hyperinflation moved so fast that survival depended on spending money before it lost more value. And that leads to the real question. When paper currency starts collapsing, what do people actually use? The historical record suggests a far more complicated answer. The first thing to understand is that by 1923, many ordinary Germans no longer had much gold left at all. And the reason did not begin in the middle of the crisis. It began years earlier. On August 4, 1914, the same day Germany entered the First World War, gold convertibility was suspended. After that, the state and the banking system encouraged citizens to surrender gold for the national cause. During the war years, patriotic campaigns urged people to hand over gold jewelry, wedding rings, watches, and family valuables. In return, many received symbolic replacements made of iron. In other words, the very asset that could later have protected a household was often surrendered long before the financial catastrophe fully arrived. That leads to one of the most important lessons in the entire story. By the time the mark was disintegrating in 1922 and 1923, many middle-class families no longer possessed meaningful gold reserves. They did not lose that protection in the final stage of the crisis. In many cases, they had already given it up earlier, at a time when trust in the system still existed and danger still felt distant. So when people today look at Weimar Germany and say, "If I had gold, I would have survived," the historical record asks a deeper question. Would the average person still have had gold by the time the crisis became obvious? In Germany, very often, the answer was no. So what did people actually use in 1922 and 1923? Surprisingly, for many daily transactions, the most practical alternative was not gold at all. It was foreign currency. Above all, the US dollar, but also pounds and Swiss francs. As the mark lost credibility, people began to think in different units. Once confidence in the local currency disappears, society starts measuring value in whatever still holds trust. By 1922, foreign exchange had become an obsession for many Germans. Anyone who could access foreign banknotes had an enormous advantage. Gold certainly preserved value, but it was not always practical for everyday transactions. A gold coin is not easy to divide. A shopkeeper cannot always make change. And in a real breakdown, transactions are rarely neat, simple, or modern. By the final phase of 1923, market behavior had changed completely. Sellers wanted to get rid of paper marks as fast as possible. Buyers wanted to turn paper into something real before it lost even more value. If you had access to foreign currency, you had options. If you had only marks, you were becoming poorer almost by the hour. So what role did gold actually play? Gold preserved wealth. But the documented record shows that gold was often hoarded, not spent. That makes sense. When weak money and strong money exist side by side, people spend the weak currency and hide the stronger store of value. That is why pre-war German gold coins, such as the 20-mark gold piece, mattered so much in theory. They could preserve purchasing power far better than paper. But for the average German in 1923, the real problem was that such assets were often already gone. And when both foreign currency and gold were unavailable, the economy did not stop. It changed form. That is exactly what happened across Central Europe from 1919 to 1923. Direct barter began to reappear. A ring for potatoes, a watch chain for food, family silver for milk, fine china for flour. Urban households carried valuables into the countryside because farmers were producing food and had little reason to accept rapidly collapsing paper marks. This is what monetary breakdown looks like in practice. The official currency may still exist, but real trust has already migrated somewhere else. During the same period, another important development emerged: Notgeld, or emergency money. By late 1922 and 1923, thousands of local entities across Germany were issuing substitute currencies. Towns, companies, and industrial operators all produced their own emergency notes. But the deeper story was even more revealing. More and more value was no longer being anchored to marks at all. It was being tied to real-world units: rye, coal, electricity, water. That is a crucial clue. When the official unit of account collapses, the economy does not die. it reprices. Commerce moves toward whatever provides a more stable benchmark. In Germany by 1923, daily life was increasingly measured against foreign money, food commodities, energy, and in more limited cases, gold, all of which made more sense than the paper mark. Who was hit hardest by this crisis? Popular imagination assumes it must have been the poor, but the Weimar case reveals another pattern. The greatest destruction often fell on the educated middle class. Civil servants, teachers, pensioners, lawyers, and salaried professionals. These were the people who trusted the system most deeply. They built savings accounts. They bought war bonds. They paid into life insurance policies. They believed the national currency was respectable and stable. Then in 1923, they watched decades of discipline collapse into almost nothing. A lifetime of savings could shrink until it was barely enough for a single daily necessity. That is why hyperinflation was not only an economic disaster, it was also a moral and psychological one. The system destroyed people who had followed its rules faithfully. So who survived best? In general, three groups were in the strongest position. First, those who controlled real goods, especially food producers. Farmers could reject paper and demand something tangible in return. Second, those who had access to foreign currency or internationally recognized stores of value. Third, those who used cheap paper debt to acquire real assets. In other words, they borrowed in a collapsing currency, bought land, factories, and productive property, and later repaid those debts in money that had become nearly worthless. In Germany in 1922 and 1923, that strategy proved extraordinarily powerful for some. Now return to the central question. If paper money is dying, how do you actually use gold and silver? The historical answer is that most of the time, they were not used in the simplistic way many people imagine. First, they could be used in direct private barter. A coin, a chain, a piece of jewelry exchanged directly for food, rent, or access to land or supplies. Second, they could be converted into the more functional parallel currency of the moment. In Weimar Germany, that often meant moving value into the US dollar or another trusted foreign currency. Third, people could stop thinking in the collapsing paper standard altogether and begin pricing everything in stable units: food, fuel, energy, or other concrete necessities. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, there was speed. In Berlin in 1923, survival often meant never holding cash longer than necessary. The moment wages arrived, they had to be converted into something real: food, transport, household supplies, durable goods, anything better than paper by the end of the day. People who treated wages as savings were ruined. People who treated wages as temporary tokens survived far more effectively. Then came stabilization. On November 15, 1923, Germany introduced the Rentenmark. But the real turning point was not just the name of a new currency. It was restored credibility. Once the state signaled that printing would not continue without limit, confidence began to return. A crisis that had built from 1921 to 1923 began to unwind with surprising speed. And what about those who had managed to keep gold through the entire disaster? In general, they preserved purchasing power far better than those trapped in paper claims. Those who had to spend gold for food made the correct choice too. Survival comes first. But those who survived through barter, foreign exchange, or rapid conversion, while keeping hard assets intact, often emerged from stabilization in the strongest position. That is the real lesson of Weimar Germany. Gold mattered, but not in the fantasy version of the story where people casually paid for bread with coins at an ordinary shop counter. Gold mattered as wealth preservation, private bargaining power, insurance outside the paper system, and sometimes as a bridge into a more usable currency. The people who were destroyed were often the ones who kept trusting yesterday's rules for too long. The people who survived were the ones who understood that once a monetary order begins to fail, it is not only prices that change. The language of value itself changes. The question is not whether people have heard of Weimar Germany. The real question is whether they understand what actually happened there between 1914 and 1923.